Sign it, Daniel, or get out of my daughter's life tonight.
She would not look at me.
Claire, you know what this document allows them to destroy.
My mother saved this deal. You're the one trying to ruin it. Choose. Your dead mother's building or your marriage.
I won't sign.
Then you've chosen.
I pulled a weathered envelope from inside my Navy jacket.
What else have you been hiding?
A small Navy compass pin slipped from the paper lining and struck the marble floor. Then Claire lifted a glass of red wine and poured it over my shoulder. Security. Across the ballroom, billionaire Victor Rowan rose so quickly his chair fell backward. He stared at the compass pin. Then he looked at me. "Where did you get that pin, son?" The word landed in that ballroom like a dropped glass. Son. 200 of the wealthiest people on the East Coast heard it. And for one long breath, nobody moved. Red wine was still soaking through my shirt, warm at first, then cold. The two security guards stood frozen with their hands in the air. My mother-in-law, Vivian Price, still held the two halves of my mother's envelope, her fingers tightening around the torn paper as if she could squeeze the moment back into shape. Victor Rowan did not touch me. He did not embrace me or explain himself. He pulled a white handkerchief from his breast pocket, knelt on the marble, and lifted the compass pin without letting his skin touch it. He turned it over and studied the back of it for a long time. Then he stood, and he did not look at me at all. He looked at Vivian. "Who tore this envelope?" "Mr. Rowan." "Who asked this man to sign a waiver tonight, at a public gala, in front of investors?" His voice never rose. That was the frightening part. "And where was that waiver notarized?" I had spent 14 years watching Vivian Price control rooms. She recovered faster than anyone I have ever known. "Mr. Rowan, this man is my daughter's estranged husband. He has been threatening this project for months. I apologize that a family matter has spilled into your evening." Claire stepped in beside her mother, and her voice was smooth and reasonable, the voice she used on television when a project needed defending. "Daniel has been obsessed with one old building, Mr. Rowan, Mercer House. He can't let it go." Victor's eyes finally came back to me, holding a question I did not understand yet. I said the only thing I could prove. "Ask her whose signature is on the waiver." The room shifted. The way you feel weather change. Victor folded the handkerchief around the pin, slid it into his pocket, and addressed the ballroom in the same quiet voice. "The $320 million this evening was arranged to celebrate will not be committed until that waiver is independently verified. Enjoy your dinner." A whisper ran along the tables like a lit fuse. Vivian's smile did not crack, but her jaw moved. She had planned for my anger and my silence. She had not planned for Victor Rowan asking about notarization. Then she did what she always does when a fact threatens her. She reached for a story. "Of course it will be verified," she said warmly. "And when it is, I hope everyone here remembers who tried to sabotage his own wife's career on the most important night of her life." She handed Claire the microphone. I want to be honest about that moment, because everything after grew out of it. Claire did not have to take the microphone. She could have said the signature needed review, or that this was private, or nothing at all. My wife stood there in her pastel pink gown with wine on her hand, my wine, and she made a choice. Daniel signed that waiver 3 months ago, she told 200 people. Now he regrets it because he can't accept that this project moved forward without him. 3 months ago, I was 400 miles away, restoring the water-damaged east wing of a county courthouse in another state. I slept on a cot in a records annex for 11 nights, and my wife knew it because I called her every one of those nights, and she rarely answered. But the room saw only a man dripping wine, a calm executive wife, and a mother protecting her daughter. I watched investors' faces close against me one by one, like doors down a long hallway. Perhaps, Vivian said gently, Daniel could wait somewhere quieter so the evening isn't disrupted further. The guards looked at Victor. Victor looked at me, and I understood his problem before he said a word. If the billionaire funding the deal shielded the accused husband, every headline tomorrow would ask what Victor Rowan was hiding. His hands were tied with a ribbon my own wife had just pulled tight. They walked me to a service corridor off the ballroom. One of the guards, a heavy-set man with gray at his temples, held out his hand. "The pin's been claimed as evidence, sir. Mr. Rowan surrendered it to event security pending review." In 10 minutes, I had lost my mother's envelope, the pin that fell out of it, my wedding ring still sitting beside a fraudulent document, and my name, in front of every person who could have helped me save Mercer House. The older guard lingered after the other left, looked down the corridor both ways, and spoke so quietly I almost missed it. "You should know they've got you on camera. Records room. Last night, 11:42. They're already showing people." "I've never been in the records room." "Then somebody wants it to look like you have." 20 minutes later, they played the clip for a cluster of board members, and Vivian made sure I was brought in to see it. A hallway camera. A man in a navy jacket, my height, my build, head angled away, walking into the hotel's records room at 11:42 p.m., the night before the gala. My stomach dropped, but not for the reason Vivian expected. I recognized the jacket. Not one like mine. Mine. There was a repaired seam on the left cuff where I'd caught it on a scaffold bolt 2 winters ago. And Claire had carried that jacket out of our apartment herself 10 days ago in the same garment bag as her pink rehearsal dress. Victor passed close behind me as the board members murmured and his lips barely moved. "Do not explain the pin. Not yet. Not until we know who altered that footage." Altered. He'd seen something too. So there it was, 1 hour into the worst night of my life. My wife and her mother had poured wine on me in front of the most powerful room in the city. A billionaire had called me son, and then been forced to stand back while I was escorted out. And a camera said I had done something I had never done, wearing a jacket that had left my house in my wife's hands. I had 3 things to prove: that I never signed that waiver, that I never entered that room, and the one I kept pushing down, whether Claire was being used by her mother or whether she was the one holding the knife. They put me in a small meeting room off the mezzanine with a guard outside the door, and sitting there in a wine-stained shirt, I finally let myself think about my mother, because everything in that ballroom had started with her. Her name was Ruth Brooks. When she came to this city at 19, she lived in a narrow brick building 6 blocks from the waterfront called Mercer House. 4 floors of small rooms built a century ago for the maids, cooks, porters, and laundry workers who kept the grand hotels running. Somewhere in those years, she fell in love with the idea that a city should keep some proof of the people who served it, not just the people it served. She spent her last 20 years as a preservation advocate, not famous, persistent. She fought for Mercer House longer than she fought for anything, and she died before the conservation covenant she'd worked on was finished. At least, that's what I believed. 2 weeks before the end, she pressed that weathered envelope into my hands. "Don't open it," she said. "Not until the day somebody puts a paper in front of you and asks you to sign Mercer House away." I remember almost laughing. Who would ever ask me that? I inspected mortar and reviewed permits. Nobody put papers in front of men like me. "Someone will," she said, "and when they do, you'll want to know what's in there." She knew. Years before Vivian Price ever drew a redevelopment map, my mother knew a signature request was coming for her son. Sitting there with wine drying stiff on my collar, that question wouldn't let go of me. How? The door opened. Vivian came in first, then Claire, then a young man from the project's legal team carrying the waiver in a clear folder. And I got my first real look at the document that had just cost me my marriage. I've spent my career reading paper, old deeds, permits, covenants. Paper talks if you know how to listen. I asked for the folder, and to look reasonable in front of the lawyer, Vivian let me have it. The signature was mine. That's what made it dangerous. The shape, the slant, the heavy D, all mine. But a signature is a movement, and movements never repeat exactly. And halfway through the last name, a stroke duplicated itself, a perfect echo. Human hands don't do that. Scanners do. And I knew where they'd found it. 6 years ago, Claire and I refinanced our apartment. She handled the paperwork and scanned every page of that mortgage file, including my signature page. The initials on page 2 were wrong too, a flat crossbar I haven't used since my 20s, lifted from some older document. And the notary stamp carried a street address that office had left a year ago. I set the folder down. I did not say any of this to the lawyer. I looked at my wife, and I asked her one question, quietly, the way you ask when you're still hoping. "Did you give her my files?" Claire held my eyes. There are moments you replay for the rest of your life, and this is one of mine. Because she didn't look confused, and she didn't look ashamed. I gave her what she needed to keep the project alive. Not, "I don't know what you mean." Not, "What files?" She'd handed my signatures to her mother, and in her mind, she had done something practical. Before I could answer, the door opened, and Victor Rowan asked everyone but me to leave. He sat across the little table, looking older than he had in the ballroom. "I can freeze the funding for 24 hours, he said. "I've done it. What I cannot do is kill a $320 million redevelopment because of what looks, to everyone out there, like a marriage collapsing at a party. The waiver is forged. Then it will be proven forged by process, not by my opinion." He was quiet a moment. "There is something else you need to understand, and I'd rather you hear it plainly. There is a trust, Daniel, the Rowan Stewardship Trust. It reviews every major project my group touches. For some time now, That trust's board has been evaluating a successor. He let that sit. They have been evaluating you. I couldn't fit the words anywhere. Me. And that is exactly why my hands are tied twice over. If I intervene for you tonight, and any part of this record makes it look like you manufactured a scandal to seize control of this deal, the board won't just reject the succession. They'll be right to. He stood, and at the door he paused. You're wondering about the word I used out there. You called me son. I called you son because that is what you have been to me, Victor said. It is not yet what the board is prepared to recognize. Tonight, the difference between those two things matters more than I wish it did. He left me with one cold new fact. Being loved by Victor Rowan and being saved by him were two different things, and the first might make the second impossible. Claire found me in the service corridor an hour later, the gala still going on the other side of the wall. Muffled music, forks on china, a city celebrating a deal built on my forged name. You want to know why? She said. I want to know when. She talked, and I let her. Vivian had told her Mercer House was too far gone to save. The project meant jobs, hundreds of them. If it stalled, the investors would walk. And Daniel would fight any proposal that touched that building, wouldn't he? Because Daniel had never once, in 14 years, put their future ahead of his mother's memory. So, you used a 6-year-old scan of my hand. I used what I had because I believed you'd understand eventually. Her voice cracked, then straightened. Confirm the waiver tonight. My mother will amend the plan. Keep the facade, a plaque, whatever you want. And you and I walk out of here still married. That was the offer. My consent, taken while I was 400 miles away sleeping on a cot, could be forgiven by her, if I agreed to it after the fact. Did you ever intend to tell me? She didn't answer. That was the answer. I was still standing there when my phone buzzed. A number I didn't know, one of the hotel staff I'd learn later. No text, just a photograph, taken from a basement doorway, time-stamped 90 minutes before the gala doors opened. It showed Vivian Price, in her gala gown, walking into the hotel's camera room, carrying a portable hard drive. That photograph changed what kind of night this was. A forged signature could be desperation. A hard drive carried into a camera room before the party started. That was architecture. Somebody had built this evening like a stage set, and I had walked onto it, carrying my mother's envelope like a candle into a room full of gas. Fine. If they wanted to fight on tape and paper, I would do the one thing I actually knew how to do: inspect the building. I asked to see the footage again. Security refused. Vivian had told them I might tamper with evidence. A beautiful trick. Accuse a man of the crime you're committing so he can't get near the proof. But nobody had thought about the banquet department, whose ballroom audio feed runs on its own system with its own clock. A young technician named Marcus ran that board. He was maybe 26, careful, and he wanted nothing to do with me at first. He'd seen the wine, heard the accusation, and helping the disgraced husband was a fast way to lose a good job. I'm not asking you to take a side, I told him. I'm asking you to play me last night's ballroom feed. Your own recording off your own board. If it clears them, it clears them. He thought about it longer than I liked. Then he put headphones over my ears. Here's what I already knew from the 2 viewings they'd allowed me. The man in my jacket walked with a slight hitch in his left step, a limp I don't have. And behind him, through an open door, a wall clock was visible for half a second. The clock read 10:42. The timestamp burned into the footage read 11:42, exactly 1 hour apart. Now Marcus gave me the 3rd nail. On the corridor footage, faint in the background, you could hear a 2-tone chime, the ballroom's sound check bell. His logs showed exactly when that bell rang the night before the gala. 10:47 p.m., not 11:47. His board was powered down by 11:47, and the log proved it. The clip hadn't been faked from nothing. It was real footage of a real man, shifted forward 1 hour. And there is only one reason to move a clock. At the true time, whoever wore my jacket needed to be somewhere else on the record. An alibi built out of arithmetic. The notary came next. Commission numbers are public. I reached her by phone from the loading dock and recorded the call with her permission. She was defensive, then frightened, then honest. No, she had never seen me sign anything. Mrs. Price had requested notarization of a duplicate acknowledgement. The original, she was told, had been executed before the project's own attorney. My identification had been provided in advance, scans of my license and passport emailed to her office. Emailed by whom? A pause. By your wife, Mr. Brooks. From your family account. There was a note. I heard her scrolling. It says, Daniel has reviewed and approved. Please expedite. Our shared account. Sent, when I checked the timestamp she read me, on a Tuesday evening from the desktop computer in our own living room. I stood on that loading dock and felt the case turn in my hands like a blade. Everything that proved the fraud also tightened the noose. A stranger looking at this record would see a husband and wife running a scheme together, or worse, a husband building a paper trail so he could later cry forgery and blow up a deal his secret benefactor's trust might hand him. Vivian hadn't just forged a waiver. She had built a record where every road led back to my house. I found Claire in the mezzanine lounge and set my phone on the table with the notary's words still on it. You didn't just give her files. You sent the email, my license, my passport. Daniel has reviewed and approved. For the first time that night, something behind her face actually moved. My mother drafted it. She stood over me while She stopped herself, reframed. You told me last spring you were willing to consider a compromise on the waterfront. Keeping the facade is a compromise. I moved up the timeline on something you were going to agree to anyway. You did not misunderstand me, Claire. You replaced me. And then she said the thing that told me our marriage had been over longer than one evening. You replaced me first, years ago, with a dead woman and a brick building. I've spent our whole marriage negotiating with your mother's ghost, and tonight is the first time I've ever won. There was truth in it. That's what made it land. I had kept secrets, the meetings with Victor, the reasons I couldn't explain. I had let silence do the work honesty should have done. She had taken my silence and built a forgery inside it, and both things were true at once. At 11, Victor convened an emergency review upstairs, a private boardroom, a dozen key investors, 2 trust officers, no press. I was given 15 minutes. I laid it out like a structural report. The duplicated stroke in the signature, the initials from a different decade of my own hand, the expired notary address, the notary herself on video link, calm and devastating. I never witnessed Mr. Brooks sign anything. The 1-hour shift in the footage, the wall clock, and Marcus's sound check bell at 10:47, backed by his board logs, and the surviving half of my mother's covenant copy, missing its final page, but real. Paper talked, and the room listened. Vivian objected twice and was asked to wait. For the first time in 14 years, I watched her control slip, a hand flattening her dress over and over, a smile held half a second too long. Victor stood. The waiver is invalid pending full investigation. The transaction remains suspended. No demolition permit touching Mercer House will be executed on any timeline connected to this deal. Mr. Brooks will be heard by the trust board with counsel present. It's a dangerous thing, winning early. Something in your chest unclenches and tells you the worst is over. I looked across the table at my wife, and because some part of me was still her husband, I gave her the door one more time. Tell them who asked you to send the email. Claire looked at her mother. Vivian looked back at her daughter and said nothing at all. No threat, no signal, just the serene patience of a woman who has already counted the votes. Daniel asked me to handle it, Claire said. And Vivian rose, unhurried, and nodded to someone by the wall. Then perhaps, she said, the board should see what Daniel did after he asked her. The screen came back on. Same corridor, same man in my navy jacket, but this cut was longer. It didn't end at the records room door. It followed him inside. The board watched the man in my jacket cross the records room, open a filing cabinet, and slide a folder inside. The camera never caught his face. It didn't need to. Vivian narrated instead. That cabinet, she said, is where a copy of this supposed covenant was discovered yesterday morning. Discovered after this gentleman placed it there. Consider the sequence, please. Mr. Brooks plants a document. Mr. Brooks manufactures a signature dispute. Mr. Brooks leverages a personal relationship with Mr. Rowan, a relationship none of us were told about, to freeze a deal his trust position would soon control. This is not a husband defending his mother's memory. This is a hostile takeover wearing a wedding ring. I said the timestamp was falsified and heard how it sounded now. The man in the doctored video complaining about doctoring. Every true thing I'd proven an hour earlier turned in the air and came back at me. The notary never witnessed my signature? Because, said Vivian, I'd built the defect in on purpose. A trap door to spring tonight. The email came from my own home? Exactly. Then it was Claire's turn, and she didn't even have to lie, which is what broke me. She only had to tell one truth without its context. That's Daniel's jacket, she said quietly. The seam on the cuff, he repaired it himself. And he wasn't home that night. He left after dinner and wouldn't tell me where he went. It was true. I had left to see Walter Hayes, a 70-year-old restoration mason who had worked beside my mother for 2 decades and who was bound by a non-disclosure agreement I would not ask him to break in public. I had a witness I couldn't use and an absence I couldn't explain. And my wife, who knew me well enough to know I hadn't been in that room, offered the board her one poisoned truth anyway. It came down fast after that, the way a scaffold comes down. One pin, then all of it at once. The trust officers suspended any consideration of my succession, effective immediately. Victor, compromised by the word son the entire ballroom had heard, recused himself from every decision touching me. The compass pin stayed locked in the security office. Vivian suggested, sweetly, that it might have been stolen from an archive to fabricate a connection to Mr. Rowan. I was barred from the records floor, the systems, the files. And the deal, I was informed, would be eligible for reactivation in 12 hours if no verified evidence emerged. Verified. Everything I had was now by definition unverified because I had touched it. At 10 o'clock, I'd had a mother's envelope, a marriage, a pen, and my name. By 1 in the morning, I had none of them, and the one man in the building who believed me had been legally gagged by his own affection. I sat on an overturned crate in a loading dock, and for a few minutes I was just a man whose wife had watched them take everything and had added a stone to the pile. That was the part I couldn't think around. Not the inheritance, I'd never asked for it. It was that Claire knew what her testimony would do. 14 years of knowing exactly who I was, and she stood in front of that board and helped them decide I was a forger to protect a story she'd told herself about being practical. I took off my wedding band. I didn't throw it. I've built my whole life around the idea that you don't destroy things in anger. You take them apart carefully and keep the pieces, because you might need to understand later how they fit. I put the ring in the inside pocket of my jacket, next to where the envelope used to be, and I made myself say the true thing out loud, alone, between the champagne crates. The papers are gone. Stop fighting with papers. Because that was the lesson under the loss. Vivian Price didn't beat me with lies. She beat me with records. The waiver, the email, the footage, the discovered folder. She had spent months building a paper world where any man who objected would look like the fraud. And I had tried to win with documents on the one battlefield she had spent a year preparing. But Vivian's world was made of files, and I am not a file man. I'm a building man, and buildings keep their own records. Records nobody thinks to forge because nobody important ever reads them. The Halcyon Grand is 106 years old, and I knew that hotel the way Vivian knew a balance sheet, because I had reviewed this very renovation for the Preservation Board. The service elevator's controller logs every trip, time, floor, and car weight. The climate system records a temperature event every time the sealed records room opens. And Marcus's audio board stamps its own independent time code on everything, untouchable from the camera room. New objective. Not prove my mother's covenant. Prove the record itself was a built thing. Waiver, email, and footage. One construction, one architect. Show the seams. I found the chief engineer, a woman named Danuta, who had once spent 3 hours arguing with me about lime mortar and had, I think, respected me ever since. She heard me out with her arms crossed. She could lose her position for pulling logs for a banned man. She pulled them anyway. "Somebody used my building to lie," she said, "and I take that personally." The service elevator log for the night before the gala read like a confession written in numbers. At 10:39 p.m., the car traveled from the technical sublevel to the records floor, carrying 1 passenger and cargo. Total load one adult plus approximately 18 pounds. The man in the footage carried a slim folder. A folder weighs ounces. 18 pounds is a camera server. They hadn't just shifted a timestamp in software. They had physically pulled the recording unit, carried it upstairs, altered it, and returned it to its rack at 10:53. Danuta's log showed the downtrip too. And at 11 p.m. sharp, the valet record showed Vivian Price's car leaving the hotel. She had stayed just long enough to watch it done. So who was the man with the limp? I laid the timeline against the Gala staff schedule, and the answer assembled itself. At 10:42 real time, every project staffer was accounted for in the ballroom except one, Vivian's legal aide, a quiet man who'd torn a knee last winter and still favored his left leg, and who had signed out, supposedly sick, at 10. By the faked hour of 11:42, he was on the record as long gone. The shifted clock was his alibi first, and my frame second. One stone, two windows. By morning, he was on a flight out of the city, answering nobody's calls. Fine, I didn't need him. I needed the last seam. How my jacket got from my closet onto his shoulders. And I already knew, and had been circling the knowing for hours because of what it meant. I found Claire in the hotel's business lounge at 7 in the morning, gray-faced, still in last night's gown, and asked her straight. She didn't dodge. Maybe she was too tired. Mother said the photographer needed it to test how the navy read under the Gala lighting for the family portrait. She heard it as she said it. I watched her hear it. I thought it was strange. I didn't ask. Claire, you don't have to save me. I've stopped expecting that. Just stop helping her bury it. That's all. Just stop. And for one moment, I will believe this until I die. She was going to. Her mouth opened, her shoulders dropped the way they used to when she finally put a hard day down. Then the lounge door opened, and Vivian walked in as if summoned by the possibility of truth. She didn't shout. She never shouts. She sat beside her daughter and spoke like a doctor delivering a prognosis. If Claire recanted, she was admitting she'd sent a fraudulent authorization. Career gone by lunch, investors' lawyers by dinner, every sacrifice she'd ever made reduced to a scandal with her photograph on it. Your husband will survive this either way, Vivian said. He has a billionaire. What do you have, sweetheart, if you burn me down? Claire looked at me. Then she looked at her hands. She chose silence. And I finally understood that my marriage hadn't ended in the ballroom with the wine. It ended right there in a beige business lounge at 7 in the morning, the third time truth and image stood in front of my wife, and she picked image. Not because she was cruel, but because she had been building that reflex her whole life, one small practical choice at a time. And I had spent 14 years politely refusing to interrupt. Marcus found me an hour later with his phone in his hand and an expression I couldn't read. Before security had sealed the compass pin into its evidence bag the night before, he'd been standing close enough to do something small and smart. He'd photographed it. Both sides. On the back, engraved so fine you'd need good light to see it, was a string of characters. I'd always assumed it was a jeweler's mark. It wasn't. I'd spent months indexing the Halcyon's basement archives during the renovation review, and I knew that numbering format. It was a real reference, the hotel's analog audio archive 60 years of hearings and civic proceedings catalogued exactly that way. Reel 8 to 17. Danuta walked me through the restoration index, since I was banned from touching it myself. Reel 8 to 17 existed, recorded the year I turned 11. The catalog line read, Mercer House Proceeding, Founder Covenant, Oral Confirmation. My mother hadn't left me a keepsake. She'd left me a map engraved on the back of a compass because she knew whoever demanded my signature would first make her paper covenant disappear, and the one thing they'd never think to destroy was a 60-year-old reel of tape nobody remembered. Except the index had one more line added the previous morning. Reel 8 to 17 had been pulled from the basement, transferred by written request of the event chair to the Gala's projection booth. Vivian had it, which meant Vivian knew the pin and the archive were connected before the Gala ever began, knew what my mother had hidden, and had been one torn envelope away from me never finding out. And in the projection queue, waiting behind the evening's celebration slides, Danuta and I found the rest of the truth. A master redevelopment map, marked confidential. Mercer House was barely a corner of it. The covenant my mother built didn't just protect one building. It anchored a conservation corridor. Break the anchor, and development rights opened along 3 more waterfront blocks. The waiver wasn't worth $320 million. It was the key to a portfolio several times that size. And on the org chart of the shining new foundation that would launder the whole thing into philanthropy, one name was already penciled in as public-facing director: Claire Brooks. There was one more file, an audio scrap in a deleted items cache, corrupted almost to nothing. Marcus coaxed 4 seconds out of it. Vivian's voice, tinny and unmistakable. Use the jacket. Move the clock 1 hour. Claire will confirm the rest. Then static. No names after. 4 seconds, damning to anyone who already believed me. Dismissible to anyone who didn't. Strong, and not enough. That was when my phone rang. Victor. The trust board had reconvened in the ballroom itself before witnesses, Vivian's demand. She had formally moved to strike me from any consideration of succession permanently on grounds of fraud. The vote was in 10 minutes. And Daniel, Victor said, there's something they've agreed I may finally say. You should be standing here when I say it. The ballroom by daylight was a different animal. Stripped tables, working lights, maybe 40 people. Trust officers, investors, lawyers, Vivian, Claire, and me. Still in the wine-stained shirt because I wanted them to look at it. Victor stood, and for once he told a story. 40 years ago, he said, he'd been a young developer with a signed deal that would have leveled 6 blocks of workers' housing. And a waitress from Mercer House had stood up at a public hearing and taken his project apart. Not with anger, with arithmetic. The argument they started that day lasted, in one form or another, 30 years. Ruth Brooks never let Victor Rowan buy her silence or her approval, and so she became the only person whose approval ever meant anything to him. Together they built the Rowan Stewardship Trust, a private structure holding the controlling votes of everything he owned, with one rule welded in: no project proceeds over the trust's ethical covenant review. When Ruth died, Victor said, I asked her son to step into the trust. He refused. He said he would not hold power over builders until he had spent years being answerable to buildings. And he asked me to keep the connection quiet, so the review of his character would be honest, so no one, including me, could polish his path. He looked at the board. 2 years ago, I designated Daniel Brooks sole successor to the trust, to the controlling votes of the Rowan Stewardship Group. Not blood, choice. That designation awaits only the completion of ethical review, and that is why I called him son, because I have thought of him that way for a very long time. And last night I was tired of pretending otherwise. The room turned to look at me, and I felt the full, useless weight of it, because the reveal saved nothing. If the board voted that I'd faked evidence, the designation died forever. And if I used what I now was to smash the deal, every lawyer in the room would call it self-dealing and be half right. Victor laid 2 paths in front of me, quietly at the side table, like a man dealing cards he hated. Withdraw my objection, protect the succession, and let an investigation grind on after the deal closed, when Mercer House would already be dust. Or invoke the trust's emergency stewardship clause in my own name, freezing the transaction tonight, under a condition written in my mother's own uncompromising hand. An invoker whose evidence fails forfeits all standing in the trust, permanently. I signed the second one. I want to say my hand didn't shake. It shook. I put every right Victor ever intended to leave me on the table. And across the room, I watched my wife realize that the building she'd called my excuse was something I would pay this much for. Vivian didn't blink. She stood and played her last card, and it was a good one. Before this board votes on anything, they should see the original footage, directly from the Gala archive, untouched by Mr. Brooks or his hired technicians. Let the evidence speak. The screen lit, the corridor, the man in my jacket. "Leave the picture," I said. "Turn up the sound." Marcus brought the audio full, and that daylight ballroom went silent and listened to the night before the gala. The 2-tone sound check bell, a rehearsal announcement rolling through distant speakers. And then, faint but clean, 2 voices caught by the corridor camera's own microphone. Claire's voice. "My pink dress is still in the garment bag." And Vivian's voice, closer, unmistakable. "Leave the navy jacket." The timestamp on the screen said 11:42. The printed Gala program in front of every person in that room said the rehearsal announcement ran at 10:47, and this was the file Vivian herself had just certified, out loud, as the untouched original. There was no one left to blame it on. She had authenticated her own forgery in front of 40 witnesses. While the room was still absorbing it, I took out the 2 halves of my mother's envelope, which I'd carried since security stopped caring about trash. I didn't reach inside. I laid the torn backing card under the projector's light, raking across it at an angle, the way you read worn gravestones. 60 years ago, someone had pressed a pen hard through a document resting on that card, and paper never forgets. The embossed ghost rose up on the screen, 10 feet tall. A covenant number. The real reference, 8-17. And a final line, blind-stamped and unkillable. "No waiver is valid without the direct, witnessed consent of the designated steward." "The real that number refers to," I said, was moved to this building's projection booth yesterday morning by written request of the event chair. I'd like it played." Vivian objected. The board overruled her. Marcus threaded the old tape with hands steadier than mine, and my mother's voice filled the ballroom where her son had been drenched in wine. Younger than I ever knew her, precise as a plumb line, confirming the Mercer House covenant into the record as the designated steward. And answering her, confirming as co-trustee, a voice 40 years younger but already unmistakable. Victor Rowan. The waiver wasn't just forged. Even with a genuine signature, it had always been void. My mother had built the lock 2 generations deep and hidden the key on the back of a compass. There was one question left, and it wasn't legal. I turned to Claire in front of everyone, and I didn't ask her to choose between her mother and me. I'd finally learned better than to make people's choices their tests of love. "When you sent that email in my name, did I authorize you?" Vivian's voice low. "Think about what that answer costs. Both of you." Claire stood very straight, the way she does at podiums, and for a moment she was the woman I married. "No," she said. "He did not authorize me." And then, because 14 years don't dissolve in a sentence, she added, "I believed he would agree later." Both halves true. A confession and a self-acquittal in one breath. The whole marriage in miniature. "That was the marriage, Claire," I said quietly. "You kept deciding my silence meant yes." The board's findings took 20 minutes. Waiver void twice over. Footage altered. The elevator and audio logs entered into the record. Material risk concealed from investors. Vivian Price removed from the project, referred to counsel, and left to the civil claims already forming in the lawyers' eyes around her. Claire's authorization ruled fraudulent. Her role in community relations ended that afternoon. Then they turned to me, because I now held the only clean standing in the room, and asked what I proposed. And this was the part Vivian never understood was possible. That a man could hold the hammer and set it down. "Mercer House stays," I said, "restored as a hospitality training center with mixed-income residences above. The waterfront project survives, redrawn. Smaller towers, the corridor honored. An independent community board with real veto power, and not one worker losing a job over the sins of the project's chair." When Victor asked the board to take up my succession then and there, riding the room's emotion, I said no. If I inherit anything, it shouldn't be because a room felt sorry for me after watching me get humiliated. Finish the review. Make me prove it. Claire found me that evening in the ballroom. She didn't apologize for misjudging an heir. Her confession was harder. She'd turned resentment into permission, and using my signature was the first decision that felt entirely hers. "I regret what I became." "I believe you, but I can't be the place you hide from it." I set her ring in her hand and walked out. Grief, not triumph. 8 months later, Mercer House reopened as a training center. The succession is mine. One sentence at the ceremony. I pinned the compass to a heart pine board at the entrance, under my mother's words. "A compass does not remove the storm. It keeps you from becoming lost inside it." "You found your direction, son," Victor said. No, I finally stopped asking other people to choose it for me. Have you ever had someone mistake your silence for permission? Tell me in the comments and subscribe for more stories like this.